EU foreign ministers are meeting in order to discuss a 10th round of sanctions on Russia. The new package is worth around 11 billion euros and is focused on export controls and fighting sanctions evasion. Apart from arms deliveries to Ukraine, sanctions are a major part of the Western response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year. The West has imposed around 14,500 sanctions against Moscow with the aim of weakening its ability to wage war. The U.S. has announced the biggest number of sanctions against Russian entities and individuals, totaling 2,527, followed by Canada, Switzerland, the U.K. and the EU. 80% of the sanctions target individuals, including politicians and oligarchs. The rest target businesses or institutions. But are they working? For more, let's bring in Janis Kluge from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. So 9 rounds of sanctions so far, a 10th perhaps coming. Let's start with that initial question. How well have they worked so far?
So the sanctions are indeed biting. Russia is in a deep economic crisis. But we also have to conclude that the sanctions alone are not enough to stop the war, and they have not created a situation that is threatening for Putin or his regime. So if we now, draw a line after 1 year, we can say that these measures are taking effect, but maybe it's a bit less of an effect than, some would have hoped at the beginning of the war.
Well, one has to assume that the EU can't impose an infinite number of rounds of sanctions. Can the West adapt its response to a multi-year war?
It is very important to adapt the sanctions all the time because Russia is finding new ways to evade them and to circumvent them. And it's very important to keep track of what is happening with Russian trade, also with third countries and with China, for example. And yes, the sanctions, a lot of the effect will come over years of time. It just takes time for these sanctions to take effect. But this will become more and more important because we are now in a war of attrition, and it will be decisive in the end, which side can actually mobilize more resources to win this war, economic resources, and here sanctions play a very important role.
So you've mentioned sanctions circumvention, sanctions leakage. EU ministers want, of course, to crack down on this. But given that most of the world isn't actually against Russia, this is very much a war of the West. How hard is this task?
It is difficult, but it's not impossible, because these third countries like Turkey, Kazakhstan, other countries bordering Russia, they also don't want to be targeted by sanctions themselves. So they don't want that it becomes too obvious or too direct that they are responsible for sanctions circumvention, because they are still very much integrated into this Western world, the financial system, and also trade flows and intellectual property. So they need access to that, and they don't want to lose it. So the West has a lot of leverage also to speak with these governments of these countries and find ways to stop the flow of components of technology that might end up in Russian weaponry in the end. And it just takes an effort, and it especially is important to keep track of what is happening in these trade flows. And I think that it's most important in the next months and years to identify the things that are being sent to Russia, circumventing the sanctions and strengthening the Russian military.
Now, there's also this argument that because Russia kept buying Europe kept buying Russian energy for so long after the war started, that the foundation was in fact laid to make the conflict last longer. What do you think of that argument?
It is true that the sanctions in the energy sphere came actually very late, because those are the sanctions that are expensive for ourselves. The other sanctions are not so expensive. But with oil, we were waiting, and with gas, actually, it was not a decision taken by the EU. It was a decision taken by Russia to end the cooperation, essentially. And now we have the oil embargo coming into force, the first step in December, the second step in February. And we see that it's actually having an effect on Russian government revenue. So it is effective, but it took us a long time to also get our own replacements, because we need, of course, to continue to get oil. And Russia was simply a very, very important supplier in the past decades.
Janis Kluge from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Now, this next story takes us to the eastern German city of Chemnitz. Before the war, Russia was a key market for its manufacturing sector. But the sanctions meant that the affected companies had to look for business elsewhere. Here's how they adapted to the new reality.
Turning, milling, drilling, accurate to 1,000th of a millimetre. The workpieces, crankshafts for cars or railway wheels weighing up to 1.5 tonnes each. The huge machines that can do this are built in Chemnitz, in Germany's east, by the Niall Simmons company. Managing Director Klaus Kreher and his team sell the equipment worth millions of euros all over the world. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, around 15% of their orders came from Russia. But with the EU sanctions, that came to an end. In the short term, we completely changed our strategy. Our main markets are now North America, Europe, and much more strongly in Germany again. We used to export 80% of our products. That's shifted significantly. Now it's more like 50-50. But the real challenge can be seen outside, in front of the workshop. These huge boxes contain finished machines worth almost 10 million euros, the second half of an order from a Russian client. Inside, the manager checks more boxes. It's uncertain when or even if anything will be allowed to go to Russia again. We now had the problem that the machines for the order for Russia had been standing here in the assembly hall for almost a year, but we need the space to process this year's sales. That's why the machines have to be taken out of the hall. Many companies in Chemnitz have similar problems to solve. Chemnitz, known as Karl-Marx-Stadt under communism, is a mechanical engineering region and traditionally has close economic ties to the countries of the former Soviet Union. At the Chamber of Industry and Commerce, Managing Director Christoph Neuberg says that smaller companies in particular need to work hard to find new customers, in South America, for example. But many have also learned from the corona pandemic. We see, for example, that European markets have actually come back into focus. That's not entirely surprising, considering the supply chain problems that were also happening. But that's something that suppliers here in Saxony can take advantage of. At Niall Simmons, they now want to try to repurpose the multi-million-dollar machines that can no longer be delivered to Russia, so that they can be used in other applications, perhaps by customers in the aviation industry.
In the face of Western sanctions over the war in Ukraine, Russian authorities have revived Soviet-era brands, including the emblematic Kama bicycles and Moskvich cars. The aim is to be self-reliant after many Western companies shut down their manufacturing sites in Russia. But if you look beyond the branding, you'll discover Russia is struggling without foreign inputs.
Russia is celebrating the comeback of the Moskvich, one of the major Soviet car brands. This one is just rolled out of a car plant near Moscow, abandoned by Renault. They come with a combustion engine and for just under 50,000 euros in an E version. But auto experts say the new car looks identical to the compact crossover JS4, made by Chinese manufacturer JAC. Moskvich won't comment on a partnership with the Chinese. A Russian economist is more frank.
When we speak about so-called Russian production, this is reprehensible. They put a Russian nameplate that says Moskvich on a Chinese-made JAC car. The car costs less than 1 million rubles in China, and it costs twice as much in Russia. This is not about the production, this is about an imitation model.
The plant aims to produce 50,000 cars in 2024, well below the output of a typical car factory. The reason? Due to logistical problems and chip shortages, China can't deliver enough parts. So a Russian supply chain is being set up, and that takes time. The Kremlin, however, celebrates the rebirth of Soviet-era brands to replace Western goods.
They probably thought everything will collapse and fall apart here in Russia. No such thing is happening. Nothing has collapsed, nothing is falling apart. Our companies, our entrepreneurs took over firms and they continue to work quite successfully. It's important for us that our domestic manufacturers get unique opportunities developing products.
While many Russians are nostalgic for Soviet brands, it doesn't apply to Soviet cars. In December and January, only 40 Moskvichs were sold, according to Russia's Autostat. The reluctance to buy a Soviet brand may have to do with their notorious fame.
Whatever they say, I prefer cars not made in our country. Because there were times when we knew that our cars don't drive very well.
Russia's car production slumped 67% in 2022 to just 450,000 passenger cars. It's the worst showing since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991.